suggest checking out some comic books at a comic book store. The Superman comics have just as much legitimacy as the Bible. They were written by people about a person with superpowers.
The Superman comic books that you buy in a store,
Yes.
are obviously legends, fairy tale, mythology. The Gospels are obviously historical narrative. Jesus is not Iron Man. Jesus is not Superman. Jesus was a real historical person who lived, taught, died. No, he respects your free will, but I think it's real clear he's not going to play games with you. He's not going to allow you to manipulate him. See, that's the way Jesus treated people. When you read the Gospels, you'll notice Jesus loved people, and he spoke the truth to them. And a young guy comes up to Jesus one day and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "You know the commands," ticks them off. The guy's following him and says, "I've done them all." Jesus takes the 10th commandment, "Thou shalt not covet," turns it into a practical test and says, "My man, go out, sell all your possessions, give to the poor, and come and follow me." The guy puts his head down and walks away. And Jesus doesn't run after the guy saying, "Oh, no, wait a second." He's spoken very clearly, very lovingly to the young man, and the young man walks away. And Jesus lets him walk. He'll let me walk, Austin. He'll let you walk.
So it seems like a punishment to me to give. It's sort of a false choice. So I'm giving you free will. I'm giving you the choice to find Jesus and find me. It's a choice in quotes. But if you don't choose, then you're condemned to eternal pain or condemned to hell. What kind of a choice is that? How much of free will is that?
That's very simple. The same choice that you have to have unprotected sex and get a sexually transmitted disease.
Oh, that's not the magnitude of pain and misery that results from a sexually transmitted disease is nowhere the magnitude of pain and misery that results from eternal condemnation.
Obviously, we agree. That was not my point. Your point was, if there are consequences to my free will, then you're taking away my free will. That's the erroneous line of your thinking, Austin. Just because there are consequences to my free will doesn't mean that my free will is being taken away. The University of Arizona does not take his free will away by saying, "You flunk, you will be kicked out of this university." That is not depriving him of free will, but it is saying, "Sir, if you don't pass your exams, you will flunk out of this place."
Yeah, but
it's that simple.
University of Arizona is not the one who supposedly gifted him with free will in the first place. We're talking about God. If God is the agent that creates free will in the first place, and then goes, "Oh, by the way, you have free will, but you have these two choices in front of you, but one of them is infinitely preferable to the other." That's not really a choice. That's not really free will. The U of A didn't give him free will. He already had it coming here. And the U of A is also not a divine entity that controls the entire universe.
Sir, I hope you respect free will. I hope you enjoy free will. If you don't have free will, you can't love. A machine cannot love because a machine does not have free will. You know very, very well that in order to love, you've got to have free will. Let's say he's been dating a young lady for the past 6 weeks. She says to him, "I love you, I love you, I love you." And he says, "Wow, that's cool." Tonight, his father calls him up and says, "Son, I've been paying her $1,000 a week to love you." Guy would be royally bummed out, wouldn't you? Of course you would. Why? Because love, in order to be real, has got to be free. If it ain't free, it ain't love. So God creates us to love him and to love each other.
It
which
seems
means
to
we
me
are
a
free.
better thing to not be given this free will and to avoid the potential of eternal damnation than it does to be given the free will and potentially condemn myself to eternal hellfire. That doesn't seem like true love. If God is going to allow some of his creations, when he has it completely within his means, he knows of all ways to guide us away from this, and he has all means by which to accomplish that, why does he then allow some of his beloved creations to condemn themselves to eternal damnation?
Because he created us as human beings, not as human machines. He created us with this incredible capacity to love, which means we have to be free. Do you really want to take away your freedom?
No, he doesn't have. We don't have to lose our free will entirely to be guided towards Jesus and towards God. We can have free will on a huge range of issues, and he doesn't even have to take away the free will in this particular one. Like for myself, if God would give me some sort of sign or come to me personally or something of that nature. Give me a little bit more evidence, because I'm thus far unconvinced by the evidence I see. Then he would guide me away from this eternal damnation, which I assume he knows that I would not prefer, and because he loves me, he doesn't want to see me get what I don't prefer. It would just take like a little bit of effort on the part of God to guide me away from this in his loving manner.
Why were the people who were alive when Jesus was around? Why did they get miracles? Why doesn't anyone else? And that was only one part of the world. So many people. Those people needed miracles to be able to find Jesus, but no one else did. No one else deserved that same, basically, like here we are. Here's Jesus going around. He clearly has God's power, God's grace, but no one else needs to see this. Was their free will taken away by Jesus showing up and performing miracles and giving teachings personally? Well, did they have less free will than us?
Obviously, all those people who saw the miracles of Christ, every single one of them doubted. All of the apostles ran away from Christ when he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. One of his 12 closest friends, Judas Iscariot, betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. Peter denied knowing him 3 times. So obviously, we all struggle with doubt. Now the question is, what do you do with your doubt? Do you let your doubt harden into unbelief? Or do you continue to pursue the evidence, continue to cry out to God on a subjective level as well as objectively looking at the evidence, and seek then to grow in faith in him? Or is there a better option? And obviously, if there's a better option than Christ, I for one am interested. If Christ is not the truth, then I want to follow the truth. But you see, I have found that the best reason to believe in Jesus Christ is because the evidence is he's the truth. And I don't want to believe a lie. I don't want to live in fantasy land. So if there is a better option to Jesus, I want to know it. So please tell me.
Better option for what?
More trustworthy, more in touch with reality, more in touch with truth than Christ. Then I want to follow him. I don't want to follow a lie.
May I suggest checking out some comic books at a comic book store? The Superman comics have just as much legitimacy as them as the Bible. They were written by people about a person with superpowers.
The Superman comic books that you buy in a store,
yes,
are obviously legends, fairy tale, mythology. The Gospels are obviously historical narrative. Jesus is not Iron Man. Jesus is not Superman. Jesus was a real historical person who lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead.
And where is your historical evidence for that over other fairy tales? Why, for example, is Thor a fairy tale, but Jesus not?
When you read comic books, you will study the literary style and realize this is make-believe. When you read the New Testament Gospels, and when you read the Quran, and when you read the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, you'll begin to understand this is historical teaching and individuals. If anybody comes up to me and say, hey, you know, man, Buddha was a myth. Buddha's like Iron Man or Superman. I'm going to say, I'm sorry. The overwhelming historical evidence is Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was a real historical person. And if anybody comes up to me and says, oh yeah, Muhammad is a myth, an Arabian Nights myth, I'm going to say, I'm sorry. The overwhelming historical evidence is Muhammad was a real space-time person. Well, the same thing is true with Jesus. The Gospels are not written in mythology or legend or romance literature. What, the Iliad and the Odyssey? Epic poetry. So when Homer writes the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's not historical narrative. The literary style is epic poem. Fine. Now, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not epic poem. They're not mythology. They're not once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wink and Blink and Nod took a boat ride. No, it's at this time, in this place, with these people around. Jesus said this, he did that, we saw it, we're writing what we saw.
I've actually taken quite a few classes, and yeah, they're written in literary styles. They're written by multiple people. Each gospel isn't even written by one person. One of the gospels was comprised of the other gospels being put together with some additional stories. These things are oral traditions written down, and they look exactly like oral traditions written down. They don't look like historical evidence.
Well, of course they were first oral traditions, because the eyewitnesses of Christ first spoke about Christ. They didn't write a gospel right as they're watching Christ die on a cross. They didn't have their pens and paper out, guys. Obviously, there was an oral tradition, and then that oral tradition was written down
But that
in the
doesn't
form
make
of
it
Matthew,
history.
Mark, Luke, and John.
That doesn't-
Obviously, that's true.
That doesn't make it history.
No, I know it doesn't make it history, but it's an important point when you're pursuing historical knowledge. Now, just listen to the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is crystal clear. It's the literary style of historical narrative. It could not be any more clear. Luke begins the Gospel of Luke by writing the following words. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. I'm sorry, sir, that is not once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wink and Blink and Nod took a boat ride. It's not Iron Man and Superman got together and defeated Thor. It's, sir, we have seen these things. I'm writing down what I have seen. Crystal clear.
Claiming a thing that is true, claiming a thing is true, and writing it down does not make it true. The Blair Witch Project is presented as factual. It's presented as some found footage. We've got plenty of examples of fiction that are presented in this light, and I'm not questioning the fact that they believe the people who wrote these things, they believed them. But like for example, Paul, who is the great proselytizer of the ancient world. He was not a witness to any of these events. He heard stories. The people who wrote these were not the actual apostles.
Oh, how do you know that? In light of the fact that the word Matthew is not attached to the Gospel of Matthew in the earliest manuscripts we have,
Right.
Where on earth do you get off saying, oh no, Matthew didn't write Matthew? You don't know that. The same way I don't know that Matthew did write Matthew.
Because
let's be honest, buddy.
because
Let's
the
not
church-
start writing mythology on our own.
The church later attached their names to it to add authority.
Yeah,
to
there
it.
was a strong tradition that pointed to Matthew was the author of the Gospel of Matthew. But I don't know that Matthew wrote it for sure, and you don't know for sure that he didn't. So let's be honest with each other and not, create mythology out here.
I'm not sure that my house isn't on fire right now. I obviously don't know because you and I weren't there. But the overwhelming historical evidence is that the apostles didn't write it.
Not
And this is-
baloney. There is plenty of early testimony
Even
that
Christian
Matthew
biblical
wrote
scholars
Matthew.
don't believe this.
Look, sir, if you don't understand that there are liberal Bible theologians like Rudolf Bultmann, Paul Tillich, like the Jesus Seminar, you better start thinking, because you're not thinking. Obviously, Rudolf Bultmann taught there were many different people that wrote the Gospels, and they really didn't know what they were talking about. The only problem is when you study the tests that Rudolf Bultmann used to determine whether the Gospels were authentic or not, if you take those same tests the way C.S. Lewis did and apply them to Rudolf Bultmann, you come up with 5 different Rudolf Bultmanns writing what Bultmann wrote. In other words, they are unfairly stringent tests. So let's be honest intellectually, and let's not start ripping it off the wall. Let's stick with the facts. And the facts are that many early people like Papias and Polycarp clearly wrote that Matthew was the one who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. But they were not eyewitnesses. They lived after, so we're not positive. So you're absolutely right. I am not positive that Matthew wrote Matthew or that Mark wrote Mark. But there is solid evidence that they did. But guess what? What does it matter whether Matthew wrote Matthew or not?
Because you're claiming these are authoritative historical accounts, that these are written by one person as their claim.
I did not say they were written by one person. I said they were written by different people, and I said that the evidence is they are historically reliable. They were written in the 1st century. And the reason we know that is because the early church fathers, like Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, Clement, Bishop of Rome, quote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in letters that they write. So it's crystal clear that the Gospels were written in the 1st century. It used to be taught on this campus and every other state university campus 50, 100 years ago that, oh no, the Gospels were not written until the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, hundreds of years after Christ.
I'm not aware of that scholarship.
That
but okay.
whole school of thought has been smashed. Why? Because we have found more and more manuscripts that go closer and closer to the 1st century. So that whole school of thought's been smashed.
Just because we moved the date because we found more evidence from 6th century to 1st century doesn't mean we're going to continue to find more evidence that moves it closer and closer to,
I never said that. I said that the evidence we have today clearly points to the Gospels being written in the 1st century. We have a very reliable historical record of Jesus of Nazareth.
Simply writing something down and say, this is true, it's absolutely true, I swear it's true. People swear things are true all the time that aren't true. Either because they believe them to be true and they're not, and they want them to be true, or because they're just being deceptive.
I'm sorry. Matthew, John died for what they claim to have seen. The dead Christ risen from the dead.
People die all the time for
Not
things
for
that
a
we
lie.
know are true.
You're right. People die all the time for their belief. But they don't die to cover up what they know to be a lie. Just look at Watergate. Dean, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, 3 brilliant American lawyers, were not willing to go through prison to cover up what they knew to be a lie. You're right. People die for what they believe is true, but people are not willing to die for what they know to be a lie. Psychology shows that crystal clearly.
Depends on how important that lie is to them.
Baloney. Give me one example of someone who dies to cover up what they know to be a lie. Give me one example. I could hardly wait to hear it.
Someone who wants to, not a specific example, but someone who wants to protect their children.
How
They say,
unfortunate.
no,
How unfortunate you can't give one example. Are you being honest? If you make these blanket statements and you can't back them up, are you being honest?
You made an exclusive statement that this thing doesn't exist, and you've asked me to prove like that anyone anywhere has died to basically keep a lie secret. Of course, people have at some point died to keep some lie secret, like the lie of like where their child is when someone's coming to like harm their child, and they lie about that, and they die to protect that. That's not.
Sir,
dying
that is
to
not
preserve
dying to cover up what they know to be a lie. Come on, think with me, sir. You're sharp, you're intelligent. Come on now. That's not fair.
Perhaps we could conceive of in World War II, there might have been at least 1 or 2 Nazis who were fighting in the German army that knew for a fact that Jews were not lower than anybody else, and yet they fought and died in that war for something that they knew to be a lie. Could you conceive of that? Does that seem conceivable at least?
No, sir.
That
The
doesn't seem
Nazis
conceivable.
were not convinced that Jews were wonderful, valuable people, and they went ahead and murdered them. The Nazis who murdered the Jews were convinced that the Jews needed to be murdered.
You can't conceive of at least one good conscience Nazi who killed a Jew, knowing full well that Jews are not below anybody else.
That's totally different, sir.
inconceivable.
Don't you see? Come on, Austin. You're sharper than that.
It's not different.
Of course it's different.
They kill.
The Nazi is killing Jews because they've got guys behind them telling them to shoot the Jews. They've got guys behind them telling them, we're going to court-martial you if you don't kill the Jews. That's radically different from dying in order to cover up what you know to be a lie.
Nazis that didn't believe Jews were lower died in World War II.
They
You just
didn't
asked for one
die to
example.
cover up a lie. No, they didn't.
That's exactly what they died for.
No, sir. False, Austin. And Austin, that's been my point to you. You're sharp, you're intelligent, but you step into some deep pits that really make me question what's really driving you, Austin. There is no comparison between a Japanese soldier dying for Japan as opposed to an eyewitness of Christ rising from the dead, standing before a Roman soldier, and the Roman soldier says, say Caesar is Lord and live, or else maintain that your Jesus is risen from the dead and we'll kill you for it. And the guy says inside, well, I know Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I never saw him, but I'm going to die to perpetuate the lie. Come on, Austin, think. It's crystal clear there's a difference.
It just seems to me that when you read the Bible, you talk about literary style, and when you read things, I'll concede that some of it is written in a very historical manner without regarding the issue of how accurate that is. It seems to me when you read things about talking snakes and people popping out of people's ribs, people living in whales, whole planets flooding, things like that seems like the stuff that comic books are made out of.
Sir, a woman popping out of Adam's rib is not an historical record of what happened. It's in the book of Genesis. It's not in the Gospels that talk about Jesus. And I can promise you, when Genesis talks about God took Adam's rib and made woman. That is not a scientific description of how God created woman. Can't you allow a writer to use some figurative speech? When Jesus says, I am the light of the world, you think he's claiming to be a 100-watt light bulb? If you have a contradiction, you've got a contradiction. The law of non-contradiction applies to every part of the Bible, which is A and non-A cannot both be true at the same time in the same way. And you have absolutely no contradictions anywhere in the Bible. Now, do you have difficult passages? Yes, you do. The flood account is an example of a difficult passage. So is the creation of Eve out of Adam's rib. Difficult passage, I agree. But come on, man. We're talking about literature that's over 2,000 years old. We're talking about people who were not concerned about the scientific question like you and I are.
Because people didn't really know science then.
Exactly. And that was not part of the agenda. So it's a little unfair to jam people who wrote a document 3,000 years ago into my scientific requirements.
The laws of nature existed and operated just as they did.
Yeah, but they're
now.
not contradicting the laws of nature if
I
they
would say
talk
someone
about the
rising
whole
from the
earth
dead.
as the whole known world.
I would say someone rising from the dead is pretty close to contradicting the laws of nature. And it's not, and a claim that extraordinary is going to take more than just a few people saying they saw it to convince me of something like that.
Obviously, you and I agree. Someone rising from the dead contradicts the laws of nature. Bravo. We all agree on that. Now, the question is there a supernatural God who can contradict the law of nature by changing a law of nature and doing what you and I call a miracle? The whole point of the Bible is not, oh, by the way, dead people rise all the time. No, the point of the Bible is, naturally, dead people do not rise from the dead. But because there's a supernatural God, it's not irrational to believe that this supernatural God can perform a miracle. And Keith, you're an intelligent guy, but I'm afraid you're making a classic mistake here. You are being too stringent on a text. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say there was an angel. They never say there was only one angel. They say there was an angel at the tomb. John says there were two angels at the tomb. If I call my son tonight and say, Robert, I had the privilege of talking with Keith today, and then later in the conversation I say, Robert, I had the privilege of speaking to over 50 people today, that is not a contradiction. Those are two equally valid perspectives on what really happened. I talked to Keith today, and I talked to over 50 people today. That is not a contradiction. Now, if I say to Robert, I only spoke to Keith today, nobody else, and then later in the conversation I say, I spoke to over 50 people, that would be a contradiction. You will notice that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John resurrection accounts are very concise. No theological explanation. Oh, this is why Jesus died. No. The death and resurrection in the Gospels are crystal clear. Very short, very concise, no explanation, no theology. These are the facts. This is what happened. Here it is. Keith, there are no contradictions. Different perspectives, yes. Guess what, Keith? That's what I want. I want different perspectives. I don't want a carbon copy, copied 5 times for me to read 5 times over again. I want different, unique perspectives. That helps me. Every time I study history, I want divergent accounts, but there better be some uniformity there, and that's what I love about the Gospels. Divergent, but uniform. Incredible internal consistency.
But if I'm writing to you about a specific event, and I say that my friend John here went to the tomb and was afraid and left, and then this guy goes in here and says, well, Dean went to the tomb and was afraid. That's not perspective. That's different. That's different. There's different people going to the tomb, different amounts of people.
Yeah.
They do different things. They
That's right.
experience different things. That's not perspective. That's inconsistent.
No, absolutely not. How many people were around when Lincoln was shot? Well, one historical record tells about certain people who were around. Another historical eyewitness account gives the names of other people around. It's not contradiction. Guess what? There were a bunch of people around when Lincoln got shot. One record is 1, 2, 3 people. Another record is 5, 6, 7, 8 people. It's not a contradiction. Does that make sense? Oh, come on, Keith. That's got to make sense. If you go to CNN, AP, New York Times, and LA Times, if you get the identical report from all of those different foreign news sources, if it's just verbatim, word for word, you got a problem, Keith. There's only one dude writing it, or one group writing it. You go to AP, CNN, New York Times, and LA Times, and you better get different perspectives. You better get different details surrounding this historical event. It's that simple, guys. This is not complex.
I mean, one of them's got to be wrong, though. I mean, you can get
No,
different perspectives.
none of them one does not have to be wrong.
If one person says one person went to the tomb, and then another person says 3 people went to the tomb, somebody's wrong. Like, it doesn't matter perspective.
Really?
It's different.
Gotta be kidding me. I went and saw the New York Knicks play basketball at Madison Square Garden. Period. Another person says, Tommy and his girlfriend, Susan, went to see the New York Knicks play basketball at Madison Square Garden. You think that's a contradiction?
Yeah, but we're not writing about Tommy. We're writing about Mary Magdalene, Mary.
Yeah.
And Mary went to the tomb. If this person knew that the other people went to the tomb, how come he didn't include them in his
Because they
narrative?
chose not to. The same way when I talk to my son tonight on the phone, I'm going to choose to include some details. My wife's going to get on the phone, and she's going to include some other details. And I can promise you, when my wife and I talk to our son tonight, we're not going to include the same details in our conversation. My wife's probably going to say, guess what, Robert? We got to pray for Dad. He got too upset and intense with some of the kids out there today. And I'm going to get on the phone, and I'm going to say, guess what, Robert? Those dudes deserved it. They were real rascals, and so I went after them. Now, guess what? That's legitimate. That's not contradiction. It's a different perspective.
It is if you say one person went to the tomb before the sun was up and one person went after.
Yeah. Your name's Isaiah. If I say Isaiah was not out here this afternoon, and then later on I say Isaiah was out here this afternoon, we got a contradiction. But if I explain who I spoke to and I don't include Isaiah's name, and then in another account I say, oh, and Isaiah was here this afternoon, it's not a contradiction. It's different perspectives, equally valid, on what really happened. It's that simple. It's not a contradiction. Unless we have this incredibly narrow Western European Enlightenment American attitude that all historical records have to be precisely the same, then the Bible has a lot of problems. But guess what? So does all of history. And you've just wiped all history off the map. Because what is history? It's a selective account of what really happened. You seen the book, The Day Lincoln Was Shot? I hope you don't think that although that book is about 360 pages long, it has every detail of what happened the day Lincoln was shot. History is a selective account of what happened. It's not going to include all the details. Does that make any sense?
I understand what you're saying. I just agree with it. I don't think it's a correct assessment of what's happening, I guess.
All right. Well, it's been a delight talking with you, Keith, and I consider it a privilege to have met you, but thanks for raising those issues.
So, we've spoken a lot about, well, just little by little throughout our talk here, we've spoken about, all right, there's a disappointing divorce rate, and obviously the world is really troubled, and we as individuals have power to influence the course of events in our countries, in our families, in our communities. And then you hear a few different things in the Bible, like we were talking about when people were held captive, children were sacrificed to see them in heaven. We're 1 week away, or less than a week away from the election, and a lot of the dialogue is on social issues, abortion being one of them. I happen to be pro-life, and I get a lot of flack for that, but a lot of people question me as a Christian. They say, well, Alex, if these unborn babies are going to go to heaven anyway, why don't we have abortion be legal and encourage that in order to limit the amount of folks in foster care? Because you look at foster care and you see recidivism. People who come out of foster care, they'll have children, and their children will go into foster care. And they'll be in broken marriages. And you see the impact of broken marriages on children and on world, state and local policy and on crime rates. And there's an argument there that says, well, hey, we need to lower crime, we need to lower debt, we need to lower social programs in order to, have a more prosperous and more safe nation. But yet, there is a clear argument in favor of life and in favor of faith to what that life's potential may entail. I mean, I know that there was a commercial out there in favor of life that looked at President Obama and said, well, hey, this was a guy who had a single mom, and she had everything stacked against her. The easy way out was for her to have an abortion, but yet she had her child, and he grew up to be president of the United States. But there are arguments on both sides when you look at all the suffering in the world and how we as individuals are empowered to decrease suffering. So can you talk about the value of life and why we ought to go on that path or not?
You bet. Great question. If there is no God, you're a piece of dirt, I'm a piece of dirt. If there is no God, you are a chance accident. I am a chance accident. Now, you and I are smart enough to say, let's give ourselves value. So because you're an articulate man who can get a high GPA at a fine university, you are really valuable. And of course, I'm valuable, and I can give you a million reasons why I think I'm valuable. But in reality, sir, if your number came up in a Monte Carlo game, and that's why you're here, and if my number came up in a Monte Carlo game, and that's why I'm here, let's be real honest. We are cosmic accidents. We're pond scum evolved to a higher order. And to try and argue that, oh, human life has this innate value, what a joke. And that is why eugenics makes sense. Let's cut off handicapped people, diseased people, because it's survival of the fittest. We have limited resources, so let's take those weak people and discard them on the junk pile of humanity. Jesus Christ contradicts that worldview. Jesus Christ says, your value is not something you earn. You can't earn it. It's a gift that God gives you. How? He creates you with innate value. Why? Because he's created you for a purpose. Your life is not meaningless. Despair is not the logical conclusion of God's good creation. Rather, because God created you for a purpose, which is to love and worship God and to love and serve others, you have innate value. Which means, I don't care what your GPA is, I don't care what your stock portfolio is, and I don't care if you're an all-American football player, or if you're such an uncoordinated klutz you can't even tie your shoes. That doesn't matter. You're still a human being given innate value by God. Why? Because he made you for a purpose. Which means, it is not my position to murder you. Now, what is murder? Murder is killing motivated by selfishness, hatred, revenge. But Alex, if I walk into McDonald's and you are spraying machine gun bullets into children's bodies, if Sam and I hit you high and hit you low and break your neck in the process, I would argue ethically that is not murder. That is killing motivated by a drive to preserve the innocent from being slaughtered. So then obviously the difficult question becomes, what is abortion? If abortion is simply removing excess skin, there's obviously nothing wrong with abortion. I cut my toenails, peel my calluses all the time. I remove excess skin from my body. Nothing ethically wrong with that. But if abortion is terminating a human life, which has innate value, because I find the life inconvenient, then abortion is murder. So that's what you guys got to figure out. It's what I got to figure out. When does human life start? Because according to Christ in the Bible, when human life starts, that's innate value there, because that's a human life created in the image of God. Now, according to every major medical center in the United States, if a, quote, piece of skin lying on a hospital bed in an emergency room has brain activity and heartbeat, doctors and nurses are legally, ethically responsible to sustain that life. Fine. Brain activity, heartbeat. 6 to 8 weeks after conception, the, quote, little piece of skin in a womb has brain activity and heartbeat. I hope we all can agree that's a human life, 6 to 8 weeks after conception. But what about before 6 weeks? No heartbeat, no brain activity. Fine. What is the difference between a 6-minute-old fertilized egg, a 6-week-old fertilized egg, and a 60-year-old fertilized egg? There is only a difference in degree of maturation, no degree in kind. 1,000 times out of 1,000, that 6-minute-old fertilized egg will pass down that birth canal, never as an alligator, never as a chicken, never as a dog. 1,000 times out of 1,000 as a human life. That is why I personally insist that once that egg and that sperm come together, you have a human life. That's why I'm opposed to abortion. But in the same breath that I stand against abortion, I have to stand strongly for adoption. And no, I do not think it is appropriate for every pregnant woman to have to keep her child. And that is why I'm so grateful for adoption and seek to support adoption. And that is a wonderful option.
I guess the problem I have, I mean, I agree with pretty much all of that, but when I'm trying to refute an argument of someone who is in favor of legal abortion, and they say, well, wait a minute, if this child is going to end up in heaven, why is that? You mentioned murder as something that's selfish and inherently wrong, but if the end result of that abortion is, well, the baby's out floating in heaven, he's, you know, back in God's kingdom, how is that a negative outcome? I guess that's the problem I'm having when I try to refute the argument.
Okay, difficult issue. Thanks for raising it. Not crystal clear. The point is, you and I are not God. God is the one who gave life. God is the one who can take life. I am not God. For me to put myself in the position of determining when you are to stop living, no, that is not my position in life. Now, guess what? That's very un-American. It's far more American to say, whatever I choose, that's right. It's far more American for me to say, authority? You gotta be kidding me. I don't care if it's British authority, or authority in the White House, or in Washington, D.C., or in Tucson, Arizona. I resent authority. I want to be the foundation of authority. I'm sorry. Part of maturing and growing up means to realize, no, I have to learn to respect authority, be it the government, ultimately be it God. But that is basically my problem with God, his authority. I do not like the authority of God when it comes to addressing abortion, how I live my sex life, what I do with my money, what I do with my life. I want to do it my way. In fact, I think I know the theme song of hell. The theme song of hell will be, I did it my way. Yeah, that's sin. I was put here for a purpose, so are we all. To love and worship God, to love and serve each other. Hopefully that's why you're getting a good education, so that you can learn with a good education how to love people better, more effectively, more efficiently. I hope you're not here simply to grow a bank account. There's got to be more to life than having a bigger bank account and a larger stock portfolio. Thank you for raising that issue. God is a being who is spirit, who has three parts: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now that's a mystery to me. Why? Because I with my rational mind think in terms of 1 and 1, 2 and 2, 3 and 3. I with my rational mind do not think in terms of 3 and 1.
Right.
All analogies fall short.
Right.
The analogy that helps me the most personally is the analogy of space in a room.
Okay.
One space, 3 dimensions: height, length, width. You take one of those dimensions away, you no longer have space. You have the walls coming together.
Okay.
You're squashed like a pancake.
Okay.
So, there's one God according to Christ, in 3 forms, 3 persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
So I guess I'm just wondering, like, why does it matter if you're a Trinitarian or a Unitarian, or you just believe, like how would you act differently if you were not a Trinitarian? Or think differently, even if you would act the same?
Good question. What are the practical ramifications of believing in a Trinity?
There have been bitter disputes about it, you know? I'm just, like, wondering,
like
what powers them, you know?
Right. Right. And in one sense, I see your point. You know, Cliff, why don't we all just chill out? There's just one God and forget this Trinity bit. Okay, well, here comes the issue.
Okay.
Jesus claimed to be God in human form. And when Jesus walked on earth, heaven was not empty. Jesus talked to his Father, but he also claimed to be God. All right? So, Jesus is God, part of God, God the Son, in human form. Now, why does that make any difference to me? I'll tell you why. I go to a Buddhist temple. I stand before the statue of the Buddha. Big smile, nice smile, eyes shut, everything crossed. Okay. Then I go to the Gospels, and I, in my mind, stand before a man nailed to a wooden crossbeam in agony. What I notice is human beings who are poor, oppressed, and suffering have an automatic connection with Jesus. Why? Because Jesus revealed he's a suffering God who you and I, in our suffering, can connect with. That, my friend, is very important to me. God is not aloof. God is not distant. When my wife stood out here and said, the reason I believe in Jesus is because I have experienced the love of God. And Cliff can go on out here and talk all about his intellectual stuff that he wants to, but for me, the basic issue is the love of God. Well, I'm just like her. For me, the basic issue is God loves you. And man, I'm praying that you're going to put your faith in his son, Jesus Christ, experience his love for eternity in heaven.
Isn't there a crucial difference, though, in that, like, unlike me, Jesus never had the experience of not knowing that he was God, right? Or not knowing that God was available to him.
Good.
Right?
Good.
So, like, doesn't that, like, in what sense is he really human if he's never experienced not being God?
Okay, very difficult question. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
Jesus was not born with the same slate that you and I are born with. No question about it.
Hold on.
All right? Meaning by that, Jesus was not born with a sinful nature, but he was genuinely tempted. Genuinely tempted, but he was not born the mixed up kid that I was born. What I mean is this. When I was born, I had some very good drives. I also had some pretty perverted drives.
Doesn't that make his resistance of temptation, like, less noble, though? Because it was, like, easier? Because he, like, wasn't a bad guy to begin with?
Not necessarily, because
All right. Maybe,
Okay.
in a sense.
Okay.
But you see, I really don't know,
Okay.
because I've never experienced being Jesus.
Okay.
But what the author of Hebrews bends over backwards to point out is Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin.
Okay.
I've been tempted. At times I've resisted temptation. At times I've caved right in. That's why I need God's forgiveness. Okay, keep going. Let's go back quickly to the Trinity.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Now, sir, think about this. This is one of the reasons why I like the Trinity. If Islam speaks the truth, that God is one, then the idea, before human beings existed, God loved, is impossible. Why? Because love always demands someone to love. You cannot love in isolation. And you see what the Trinity points out is that throughout eternity, God has loved. Father's loved Son, Son has loved Holy Spirit. So God has been loved throughout eternity. Why? Because God is not just a singular. God is one, but he's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's why when John writes, God is love, he's saying something different than the Quran.